Hello everyone, welcome back to another coding tutorial. In our previous lectures, we covered the topics of classes, objects, and encapsulation, and the goal of this coding tutorial is pretty much to show you how all of these topics work together, allowing you to create a comprehensive class and working with objects from that class. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want you to know is that technically when I'm writing this code, I am going to be within a package or a folder so that all of my code can be found from one location. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a new Java class. In our example, we're going to work with the one that I showed you in the lecture, which was a student class. So in this case, we are going to name our class student and go ahead and finish that up. I'm just going to go ahead and clean this up because we don't need all of that right now. And I'm going to go ahead and give us some information. So this is a example of a class, objects, and using encapsulation. All right. So just a little idea of what we're going to be doing. Now, I know I typically start off with the main method in my class. In this case, I'm not going to use one, not just yet. But of course, as you all know, we do need a main method to run our code. But where we have that main method can vary. So just stick with me right now. We're going to skip the main method at this moment. So first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically start off our class. Now remember, our class typically deals with the object, and obviously in this case, because our class is named student, then we can assume that our object we're working with is going to be of a student. So the first thing we need to do is give our student some attributes or some properties, which would pretty much map out to our private fields or our fields, for example. So actually, let's just start off with our fields. So fields, which are going to be our object attributes or properties. All right. So we'll just say object properties so it's not confusing. Now to get started, we'll go ahead and place our different variables or our fields in here. So string, we'll say string name. We are going to say, let's say string classification. We'll do double GPA. And then we'll say string major. All right. So far we have some fields that we'll be working with in our student class. Now in this case, we are not using encapsulation yet. I'm going to apply that later. But so far this is just creating a class and some fields for that class. So now that we've done that, we can go ahead and pretty much say, let's create an object, right? So what we could do is we'll create our constructor, which will create our student object. All right. Now, remember your constructor has to be the same name as your class. In this case, we have it as student. So we'll say public student, and we're going to set that up here. Oops. All right. Now, what we're going to have to do is actually initialize the object and give it some values. So that's what we need to do in this case. So if we say string name, because obviously our student needs a name and all of the other fields. So that's basically what our constructor is going to take in, the other fields. So we'll say string name. We will say string classification. we will say int, not int, double GPA, and we'll say string major. All right. That's basically saying that we're going to be taking in all of these data values to utilize and set up our fields or our objects when we create it. And remember, we talked about using the this keyword. That's going to connect back to the fields. All right. So basically, what we have here, these values we have here, are not directly connecting to the fields up here. They're placeholder values. Remember, they're placeholder values, so they only exist in the constructor. The ones that does exist are up here, and that is where we're going to use the this keyword. So this dot, and you see it's popping up, it's pretty much saying you want to use the class fields. So it's finding these because the class, these belong to the class. So when you say this, it's saying you want to use this class dot whatever you're referring to. So it will pull from here. So we're saying that this class dot name is going to equal name from our input, as you see highlighted in green. So it's connecting these two together, the one that's on the right side of the assignment operator. So that would be setting name, and then we do this dot classification. We're going to do the same thing, classification. You see it's going to highlight in green, and we're going to continue to do that with all of these. So double GPA, or actually, excuse me, I meant this dot GPA is going to equal GPA. And then lastly, we have this dot major is going to equal major. All right, so we are setting our values for when our object is created. That's pretty much what's going on here. Okay, so far we have our fields, we have a constructor, we do not have a object yet, and that is where we need to go next. So overall, our class isn't really doing too much, as we haven't technically told it to do too much. But that is also what we need to work with going forward. So now that we technically have something that will create our object, we need to also have some method that we can use with our objects. So we can say here, we'll say like methods, instance methods. And basically, we're going to have those do a certain behavior or what we can use or work with in our code. So in this case, let's say we want to print out the info of our student. So let's say public void, because we're not necessarily returning a data value, print info. Oops, like that. All right, and inside of here, we are going to use some print statements. So system.out.print line. And in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so that I can reuse it when I need it. And we'll say here, we'll say student name plus name. Going to paste my print statement. We'll say student classification plus classification. Oops. I'm going to do it again. So student major plus major. And lastly, we have our GPA. Student GPA. All right. Now, what I'm also going to do is just print some like spacers for when it comes out. That way we can separate them. So I'll do that here. Do that again. Just for some separation purposes when we print. All right. So now that we have that, we pretty much have a method created for our class. We have a constructor. We also have our fields for our class. So we pretty much have a great start to a class. Now we just need to have some objects for that class. So what we need to do is create a main class. So think of the main class as pretty much the main method. You're naming the class based off of what it's doing, and that's pretty much running our main method. So that's what we're going to do now. So we will need to go to our folder that holds our student.java file. So yes, you do have to have both of these classes in the same location for this to work. So I'm going to go to my source package. I'm going to add a new class and I'm going to name it main. And then that is all. Okay, now you see here, I have main there and I have student there and they are in the same folder. So they have to be at the same location for them to work out well. So here we're going to say this is a main method that we can use for our student.java class. All right. We will use this to create student objects. All right, so now we have some information, so we can go ahead and get started from here. Now, first we need our main method. So as we've been using up until this point, so public static void main string and args. Right? So we have our main method set up. Now what we can do is create our student objects. So create a student object from student.java. Okay? Oops, forgot the A. All right, the very first thing we need to do is call what that object is going to be. In this case, we are using the student class. So we're going to say student, and then we are going to give it a object name. So we'll say S1 for student 1. Then we're going to say equals new student, like that. And we'll go ahead and give it that semicolon to end it. Now what we need to do is match the constructor of our student. So if we return back to our student, you see our constructor is taking in the information in this format. So you see its name, classification, GPA, and then major. So you do have to remember how you inputted those. So first we have name. So here we'll give it a name. So we'll say James. Comma. The next thing we had was our classification. So we'll say he is a freshman. Then we had our GPA, I believe. So we'll give him a 3.0 because we're expecting a double. And then we said, lastly, a major. So we'll give him a major and we'll say computer science. All right. So now you see all of our errors went away because we have matched it to a constructor that we have. So to give you an idea, if you were to do another student, you would just say student, give it another name, equals new student, and then we'll give it some information, but I'm going to show you what happens if you don't give enough information. So let's say we just did a student like this. You see how we just gave it one name and nothing else. It's going to give us an issue because if you hover over, you see it says constructor in the student does not have anything that applies to this given type, meaning there is no constructor in our student class that only accepts one input or one parameter of name. Our constructor has 4, and if you look in our notes there, it says required string, string, double string. What we gave it was just a string. Therefore, your code is going to cause a problem because you don't have anything that established that. So that's why it's confused. That's why we're getting an error. Now, what we could do is go inside of here and then give it some more information. But I'm going to show you why it matters, the placement, depending on the constructor. So remember it said it's looking for a string, string, double, and a string. So technically you could put whatever you want. But in our case, we had it as name, classification, GPA, then major. But if I were to put, let's say, our major here, then I still have to give it, my double value for it to not be confused. So we'll say 4.0. And then I'm just pretty much here, I'm swapping my classification for my major. So we'll say senior. And we are going to say input is not correct format so that you will notice. So this is the correct format. And the other one is not. Okay? So we're going to see that in a few seconds. So now that we have our objects, we can use our objects. And the very first thing we can do is do our methods. So using object methods. And we pretty much only created that one, which was print info. So we will say s1 dot print info. Then we'll say s2 dot print info. Okay? So right there, we have created our objects. These are connecting back to our student.java class, and it will allow us to work with the information from there. So if I go ahead and try to run our file, then you see it gives us out our information. And you see here that we have the output from our two objects. Now take a look, because we had it separated properly. We have those dashes. We have our student name is James. His classification is freshman. His major is computer science, and his GPA is a 3.0. Now, if you take a look at Will, remember we put his information in correctly when we did our object creation. You see, Will mapped out correctly, but remember we swapped our classification and our major when we were doing our object initialization or calling our constructor. So because we inputted our data values wrong here, we did not do it in the correct order that we stated in our constructor here, it caused us problems. Because what I did was I put in, instead of name, classification, GPA, and major, what I did was name, major, classification, then GPA. And that is because your constructor does not necessarily know what order your values are going to be in. It just knows the order that it is accepting those data types. So you basically can put in any information you want as long as the data type meets the criteria, it will still run. So you do have to pay attention to how you're inputting your information when you're creating your objects. So technically, because we inputted our information in correctly and we did not match the format of the constructor, we did have output issues, although our code runs. So for us to fix this, we would simply have to change our values around. So this one would be senior. And this one would be our major, which is English. And we're going to run this again. And now you see our information is correct. So you do have to pay attention to how you are creating your constructors when you're working with them. Now, technically, from this case, we have created a class and we've created objects. And I have just showed you how to do that and connect it back. So we are using two different program files for this, student.java and main.java. Main.java allows us to create our student objects. So that is the use of your main class. Now what we're going to do is work on our encapsulation. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to our student.java and we're going to work on our encapsulation. So encapsulation is that we need to make sure that our data is protected. So here we do not have our data protected. It is basically open. So what we need to do is specify that it needs to be private. So that's what we are going to do. So this will be our encapsulated data. Here we are going to add in front private to all of them. And that is going to protect it and store it within the class. Oops. Private. One more. Private. All right. So we made those private. And we can leave our constructor for right now, but what we do need to do is have our getters and our setters. So first, what we're going to do is have our getters to get the information. This is for read-only access to our information. So here we're going to say getters, read-only access to the data. And you would need a getter for each field that you are trying to retrieve. So we have first public. Remember, our getters and our setters are going to be public. So public string is what we're getting, and we're going to say get name. Literally, all we're doing in here is returning name. We're going to continue to do that for all of our data. So get classification. And then we're returning classification. All right. Then we are doing our next value, which is public double get GPA and return GPA. Lastly, we have our major, so public string get major. Oops. And then we are going to do return major. All right. So that pretty much allows us to access our private data values from the class. That's what it's doing. It's basically saying you can only read it, you can't change it, you can't do anything, you can just see what it is. That's what our getter is doing. So now we have our getters. We also want to do our setters. Our setters are going to give us more control and make sure that our data values are valid. So for example, we can have our setter section, and this is going to control data updates. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to first start with, let's say, for example, our classification. So we could say public void set classification. And I'll just start it off like that. So first, what we need to do is give it some sort of value. Remember, our classification is going to be technically a string, so we'll just say string class. Okay. Now in here, what we're going to do is use our inputted information to make sure that it is what we expect it to be. So if, and what we can say is if class is not equal to freshman, all right, let's see. Give me 1 second. All right. Oh, yep, I know what it is. If string classification. All right, because I named it class. That's why I didn't like it. So if classification is not equal to freshman, or actually what we could do is say, let's see here. We're just going to say dot equals. That'll be better. Let's think about my number values first. So we'll say here, classification dot equals, we'll say freshman. And then another case we could do is our or. Classification dot equals, we'll do sophomore or classification. So you see what I'm doing is pretty much placing different validation measures into place to make sure that we are going to set our classification to a known classification. That way the user cannot just go in and put in any data type or any data value for that matter. Kind of like what we did where we set our classification and our major and we switched them. This is preventing that from happening. So we're basically setting up a rule that would prevent it from happening or allowing the user to do that when they create the object. So in this case, junior, we have our last one. Let me see. Oops, that's what it did. Didn't close this out properly. All right, we have that. And our last one is our classification dot equals we're going to do senior. All right, so we have that in place. That is pretty much our if statement. I'm going to come down here and, excuse me. I'm going to come inside of my if statement and then place some information in it. So we're basically going to check if our input is one of those. If it is, then we can say this dot classification is going to equal classification. All right. So that's pretty much trying to add some control over what our user is inputting in for our information. So this is going to be the end of our setter right there. Another setter we can have is making sure that our GPA is good. So we could say public void set GPA. That's going to take in double, let's say GPA. And here, typed extra E. Inside, we're going to say if GPA is greater than or equal to 0.0 and GPA is less than or equal to 4.0. Then what we're going to do is say this dot GPA is going to equal GPA. Now in this case, I forgot that I technically capitalized my GPA, so let me go back and change those. GPA. All right. So this one here is going to make sure classification is freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. Now, of course, you can do the, ignore case and all of that if you're trying to worry about how your user is going to input the information. Of course, that's up to you, but I'm just kind of giving you a gist really quickly of how this would work. Here, again, we're just going to say what this is. Make sure GPA is between 0.0 and 4.0. All right. So we basically have our setters in place. Now, in our constructor, we can basically change these to ensure that we are doing it valid. So I'm just going to comment those out because that was one way you could do it. But that's if we're not making sure that our input is a valid input. So in this case, now what we can do is actually what I'll do here, here. We'll go ahead and use our setters here. So we could say here we want to set set our classification. So set classification. And we'll say classification here. And then same here, set GPA. We're going to say GPA here. All right, and this would pretty much use our setter for validation. Same here. All right, so now that we have that, we'll come here back to our main method and kind of run with it from here. So now that we have that, we have our object. we can go ahead and move forward. In this case, we have it here, senior English, and we'll go ahead and run that. So we didn't necessarily change anything on this value. As you see, everything worked out fine. We don't necessarily see anything happening with our validation. So if we were to go ahead and let's just say we try to change this to 7, because that's technically outside of our values, then you see it pretty much set his GPA to 0. That's because we put that validation in that says the value has to be between 0 and 4. So when it was not that value, it pretty much made it 0 because it's not going to set it. So if we didn't give it a value, it automatically gives it the default value, which is 0. So when it didn't meet the criteria, it pretty much believed that we did not give it a GPA value to work with, so it just returned a default value of 0 to us. Same with this case. If we were just to say, like 10th grade, for example, we're going to test this out. All right. You see it returned his classification as null. Again, default value. So this is where our null is coming into play. Same thing technically is happening with the GPA, except when you're working with numbers, the default is by general is 0, and that's why we're not getting it. But as you see here, because we are giving it the wrong values, we are going to see that it does not work out how we needed it to, because our validation did not meet when we are working with our setters. So now that we have that, so in this case, our S2 is invalid. So what we need to do is update our S2 object to have valid data. So now what we're going to do is we are pretty much going to work with our S2 object. So we're going to say S2. Now the two things we need to change is our GPA, and we need to change our classification. So what we will do is say S2 dot set classification. We need to set our classification. We need to give it a value that it understands. Now remember, we said freshman, sophomore, junior, senior with a capital. So I'm going to say set junior. All right. That would help me change the value of my data. Now it will only change if I meet the validation criteria, which, I stated it's either going to be freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. Now what we're also going to do is change our GPA because we said a 7. So we're going to say S2 set GPA. We're going to give it like a 2.5. So now we're setting our objects to have valid data. And then once we change it, we're going to need to see it to verify that. So we're just going to say set print info. All right. So now that we have that, we basically are trying to set our values. We're also still protecting our data, making sure that we're getting the values that we're looking for. We're going to go ahead and run that. Now here we have both of those side by side. So you see first when we created our object, we initially created it incorrectly. Although it works, we did not have the expected valid input that we were looking for. And this is why encapsulation is important, because it still ran our code, but it was not the format we were expecting it to be in. So this is how your getters and your setters come into play, because all I had to do was then run my set method to change that value to what it needed to be correctly. So it instantly changed our null and our 0 to junior and 2.5 because we reached the correct valid input that we specified over here when we were creating our sets, um, our setters. So we had those validations in there. And that is why encapsulation is so important. It basically is protecting how our data is presented, how it's inputted, and how our user can work with it. So I'm not going to continue to drag this on any further. I feel like we had a lot of good content, but basically, the idea here is that you can create a class that deals with an object. In this case, we have student. We created getters and setters to keep our information encapsulated, basically providing read-only access, and our setters, which are setting our values to be valid. And then what we're doing is we're actually creating our object in the main method over here. So we're not necessarily doing our main method directly in where our class is. We're doing it over here. But just to throw it in there for you all to see as well, you can do your getters. So for example, you could just simply say like system dot out dot print line. Then you could say like s1 dot get name. Oops. Like that. And then of course that's like if you wanted to see like your data value, so you can run your file and you see it just got our name for us. That was it. So of course you can use the information stored in a variable using it in other ways once you get the data. But that's pretty much why encapsulation is important. It allows you to get information. So we're getting the name here, but we can't change it. We're just getting the information. The only thing we can change in our case is our setters. So we can change like our classification and our GPA, but we're controlling what they can be changed to. So we're ensuring that our program is still running effectively. And that's pretty much showing you the importance of encapsulation. So encapsulation goes hand in hand with your classes and your objects to make sure that your data is protected. And that's pretty much what we have displayed here in this coding tutorial. So I'll go ahead and stop it right here. Pretty much we have covered our major components that we covered in our previous two lectures, which was classes, objects, and encapsulation. And now you should be on your way to creating well-constructed classes and objects to work with them. So thank you for watching this coding tutorial, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next lecture.